Hi, everyone. Hey.
So Bucky, as you know, saw the world differently. And within this slide captures that in probably the most eloquent way. What we see is the grid, and the grid morphing into two floating bucking domes locked inside his lens. Now, the idea of the lens becomes extremely important to us. It is the extension of the human body. It is an interface with the outside world. It functions as a prosthetic. It allows us to see both the very large and the very small. It allows us to see both the very slow and the very fast. In essence, what it does is it reveals the invisible. Now, I don't know about you, but this floors us. It borderlines on a superpower. And when coupled, this idea of the invisible and being able to see it, with the forces of computation and simulation, what it then in turn reveals is time. And if one has access to time, they can not only see and read the past, but begin to project into the future. And we see this future as a series of shock waves. And maybe even a better analogy here for the West Coast is the surfer. The idea that the surfer goes to the ocean, identifies the optimum wave, deploys themselves out to wave, and rides it back gloriously. The difference being is the waves that we're riding are embodied and embedded in architecture.
So we start off with the word craft. It's an acronym for computation, research, analysis, fabrication, and technology. These are fundamental pillars of our design process. Much like the previous images that we've seen that were mapping the invisible, these forces are all around us. Craft is all around us. It's in the cars we drive. It's in the spaces we occupy. It's in the hardware and software we interact on a daily basis. These territories are constantly expanding, and as they expand, they begin to move into architecture. As the architecture, as you've seen and you experience, and we're in one, needs to be mapped in a certain way. So we're using the craft stamp to begin to open up, can we map the invisible, or as we like to think of it, can we design the future of architecture? So the first project we'll introduce, simple premise. What would a building look like if we can harvest multiple rays from the sun? The inspiration and direction came from a biological model. In this case, it's the reptile, specifically the skin and its ability to absorb heat. With the craft stamp, we looked at multiple things. One, what are the potential new geometries that allows us to produce new species or new breeds of architecture? Secondly, what are the next generation of sustainable technologies that allows us to harvest solar energy? Lastly, what are the manufacturing tools that potentially streamline the architectural production? We wanted to experiment. We wanted to conduct an experiment that allowed us to test this idea. We looked at the building in New York City, in this case, the United Nations Tower. The UN building, when it was designed, wasn't quite sufficiently designed. The east and west facade allows too much light and heat to come in, thus making the occupant extremely uncomfortable. And you guys have been into spaces where it gets too hot, you start to agitate, and you don't like the space. So we saw this as an opportunity to deploy, or rather give a facelift with the reptile skin. This project allowed us an opportunity to introduce the reptile skin, but more specifically, thicken the skin and stratify material and performance. By doing this, we had to basically do something that's unconventional. Where most projects try to block the undesirable forces, such as sunlight, we set out to actually absorb that undesirable forces, take it, transform it, and redirect it into the project. With a very simple performative gesture, we're able to produce this articulation of the fin. With the fin, we're able to do three things. First, shade the building from direct sunlight, preventing it from getting too warm inside. Second, we're able to take the light shelf that we're able to produce, bounce light deeper into the space, and produce more natural light conditions within the space, thus allowing us to rely less on artificial light. Lastly, we're able to take the architecture, specifically the fins, and populate a photovoltaic technology. It's indicated here in this image with the dark surface, the photovoltaic lens or cell, excuse me. With this, we're now testing and understanding what is the potential for new species to come about in architecture.
So moving on from the alligator to the shark, and where the previous project was using light and the sun at its generational force, this one uses the wind. And the idea that wind is one of the most ancient forces that roams the planet. It is cloaked in myth and mystery. It was the force that allowed our early explorers to chart the globe, and what we feel to be the force that's going to allow us to occupy the future in a much more sustainable way. So Brooklyn Mosque is located in Coney Island, Brooklyn. And what we were attempting to do is to challenge the idea of transparency from a cultural, literal, and political standpoint. This is a very sensitive issue to begin to build new mosques in New York. But what we decided to do is to both wrap it and encase it in glass, and then a secondary shroud, an almost ethereal mist that allows for not only light to come within, but to begin to project the interactivity outwards. And so to tie one back to this shark, and taking that core geometry as a departure point, what we began to realize, and if you remember any of the discussions during the Olympics and the Speedo suits, this actual geometry produces a low-pressure pattern behind the scale. We took this, scaled it up, put the secondary skin against the glass. This low-pressure zone actually pulled energy and heat from the building, in essence, making it a much more comfortable scenario space. An unanticipated result of working from the outside in were these kaleidoscopic spaces. We can see a children's play space here on the roof, some of the prayer spaces down at the bottom. It's like being locked within a giant disco ball.
So the last project, much like the first two projects, the premise was quite simple. What would a building skin look like if we could harvest moisture from the atmosphere? Like previously said, like the first two projects, we looked at biology, a biological model. In this case, the amphibian. The amphibian, specifically its skin and its ability to absorb moisture or water to extract oxygen. Looking at the morphology of the amphibian helped us understand the biology, chemistry, and physics involved in incorporating water into the skin. Now, in order to do this, we again had to think unconventionally. While most buildings are designed to keep the water out, right? We all know that, right? We set out to design something where maybe we should design a skin that brings water in. Additionally, we looked at other sustainable measures to begin to produce a culture, one of which was to maximize the glass, specifically from 5 feet to 15 feet. The other, specifically, let me step back here, I'm sorry. Our interest was to compress the space between the occupant and the outside world. By increasing the glass size, we're bringing more natural daylight in and eliminating any obstructions that blocks your view looking out. Our first design decision set the trajectory of the project, which was, again, to maximize the size of the glass from 5 feet to 15 feet. Now, there are issues when you do that. There are structural issues. For this, we decided to introduce a new technology, what's called slumping. Slumping the glass involves introducing a fold or an inflection within the cross-section of the glass. Much like you take a flat sheet of paper and you fold it, which one's more structurally sound, right? Additionally, by making the glass self-supporting, there wasn't a need for metallic mullions to begin to support the glass. Let me take a moment here and just step back, and let's dissect the facade in this case. The facade is broken up into two major areas. The first region is the upper region, which is primarily dealing with the ability for the skin to harvest solar energy. And it's done through use of photovoltaic pipes. Additionally, along the top edge of each floor, indicated by the circular white dots, there are small parabolic dishes that begin to absorb natural daylight. This natural daylight is then pushed through a fiber optic cable that stretches 50 feet into the space and emits natural daylight. So, in theory, you're in a space and you have natural daylight hitting you at all points of the space. The second portion, which is the lower area, that deals primarily with the harvesting of water, right? H2O. In this case, we introduced a chamber. And that chamber is slightly cooled so that there's a different temperature from the outside and the inside. When you produce this differential, it starts to produce a condensation within the lower chamber. And as this condensation builds up, it produces water for us. You guys have all produced this experiment once in your lifetime. You've all enjoyed a cold beverage with ice. You place it on top of the counter surface, and condensation starts to appear on the tabletop surface, right? So this method, we're scaling it up at the size of architecture. Like all our projects, we're very conscious of where the project lands. So as the project begins to move across the United States and hopefully globally, we understand that the project we produce has to relate to its environment. So in this case, as we begin to understand the project in San Diego, we know that the project will be very different in New York. In what sense? We begin to recalibrate the technology portions. We begin to balance the amount of technology that begins to be embedded within the thickened surface.
So those of you in California are more than aware of how precious water is, and that's really the departure point for this project. And arguably within the next 20 to 30 years, it's going to be one of the most political battlegrounds that you're going to fight. So luckily, this is a project is extremely greedy. Not only is it extracting what little air there is, or little water there is within the air, it's holding on to all of the waste that's being produced within. So in essence, this mat of biomass is covering the roof, operating as a filtration system that takes the wastewater in, moves it through a series of sequential planting strategies, and eventually becoming usable water at the end that goes back into the building. So the whole system, as a kit of parts, blurs that line between the interior inhabitant and the outside world. And this becomes crucial. It's that through that inflation of the skin, through the placement of new gases, new materials, biomass, mechanical systems, that we're actually able to produce things that not only clean the water, clean the air, and also produce energy. So where does this leave us? What does this mean for us in our future and you as the ones that will begin to take this mantle upon yourselves? And I think as a quick detour, beginning to look at the phone as this evolutionary tool that has been around for 100+ years. And at each one of these, there's a phase straight transition that makes it unrecognizable from the previous. We do not know where the phone is going. And in turn, you have to look at this or technology in much the same way. The technology that you will be using in the future has not even been invented yet. So how could one prepare? You prepare by stabilizing yourself, building a foundation that has much more to do with the concept of technology and its historical roots than anything else, and willing that into the future.
So, in order to understand the future, you must understand the foundation from which everything begins, or rather, the raw state from which things become. And so with that achievement, you can then begin to produce, or rather, participate in the discussion about the future. You'll be able to produce evolutionary models that begin to produce new visions for the world. So, basically, you have the kind of chemistry, biology, fabrication, which is under the umbrella of computer science, right? The kind of rawness to that. That can potentially move into new materials, like aerogel, lighter materials, or even 3D printed organs, or robotic manufacturing that begins to influence architecture in new ways. And this is under an umbrella of computation. So you go from the raw data to organized strategic commands of codes.
So we want to end today with a quote from Arthur C. Clarke, and him stating that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Magic, the unbelievable, wonderment is things that we are very much invested in. We are big dreamers, and I think that you ought to be as well. So one thing of note, that magic and dreams will not find you. You have to seek them out. It's your responsibility as the architects of the future, to put these pieces together and become the champion and the advocate for both culture and society. And it's begun today. It's begun by you starting this journey and graciously hosting us here. And we would like to thank you.
Thank you. Well, everyone.